And we identified potential places for that. Obviously, on Dorman Point is a wind opportunity. There's not a lot of wind opportunity here. The marina was the place for the ocean loop. And then in conjunction with the community center development and the school, the potential for geothermal exchange. So buildings, we looked at green design, we looked at densifying the cove beyond what was in the zoning at the time. And so for green design, we looked at geothermal potential, we looked at the ocean loop and serving a number of buildings. We looked at recirculating water and taking advantage of things like the forest on the north sides of buildings and allowing more sunlight on the open sides of buildings that face the sun. Sort of basic architectural design. More of the same. And just some quick examples. We wanted, at the time, we included many photos for people to understand what we were talking about. It wasn't a radical spaceship type of building or anything. The other thing that was important was the open space in the cove. And identified those in the original thinking that I showed you, but this is something that helps contribute to community. The ballpark that's there, for instance, was something that we kept. We thought it needed to be enhanced and become more of a focal point, but there were many other locations throughout the cove for open space. This was a map of parks and open space. So here again, you see that pedestrian walkway as a green walkway leading up to the community center and school and down to the middle lower cove. The beginning of Kirkland Park was reserved as it is today as a green space. We did occupy the lands that are part of the surplus lands, as you can see there. And as I zoom in on the controversial point of every plan, the ferry marshalling, I'll show you that we basically encroached on the park, I think something like 7 or 8 feet. It really was not a radical move. And this little green dot was the heron nesting area, which I know continues to be an issue to this day. We actually put a landscape fence around it and demarked it so that it was sort of eternally saved and part of the plan, so that it no longer continued to stop development everywhere, that it was simply protected. And we also looked at public spaces. That's the red dots. So this is the North Pier that we looked at. It's interesting, it's kind of the end of the road for the island, and I don't know as islanders if a lot of us go down to that area, but a lot of visitors do. And we saw that as one of the important public spaces on the island that could be enhanced and thought of. There was a new space that was thought of at the crossroads in front of the library, which we called Cenotaph Square, which essentially was an enhanced Remembrance Day that kind of made us remember throughout the year in a sense, so that it was another gathering place where the roads could actually be closed, as we do on that day. We managed to squeeze ourselves between the ferry arrivals and occupy that space. And we thought that was a great opportunity for other times of the year to have events and allow the design of the public space to allow for that. Similarly, at the major crossroad intersection up by the old pub and everything else that we know on that corner, we allowed for a closing of the roads at certain times. So at Bowfest and other things, there would be a moment there as well. And then there were 2 other spaces. There was what we call the Civic Front Porch, which was the community center that we did an early design for, and I believe is still thinking of being located on that site. Would have what we call the front porch, where there was more of a casual ability for people on the island to interact with the front of that building, something we don't have a lot of. And behind it, there's, I don't know how many of you have hiked through this area, but there's a really cool bluff that we wanted to preserve behind that, which became the lookout and was connected to the community center so that you could actually see out beyond that. There's a number of other things in this plan, but if I took all day to present them, we wouldn't get through it. This is just another image to inspire people to think about the community center and some of the spaces that we might have on the island. So the economic development was as key as anything. As I mentioned, we interviewed all the business owners, or almost all of the business owners on the island. And at the time, we found a fair amount of anger, I would say, with that community. They were upset that there weren't in the thinking on the island, there wasn't greater consideration of the businesses that are here, that there wasn't a consideration of how to make the businesses operate reasonably well, how to integrate them into other types of development, like the ones that have been successful with housing on top, that sort of thing. Issues of parking, all those sorts of issues came up, and we tried to address as many of those as we could. So these were the commercial nodes, as it were, that we identified, both existing and future. And you can see that we really tried to concentrate things in the Lower Cove. This is the library here for context, including trying to make sure that there were some business activity on the other side of Government Road. And this may be controversial, but we feel it's critical to the functioning of a commercial area. All of the places that we've designed around the world are a double-loaded street in a sense. They have businesses on both sides of the street. People like to have the experience of walking down one side of the street and the other. There's usually a loop that people do. And if you think of most great commercial streets, certainly in North America, but in most places around the world, they tend to be no more than 3, maybe 4 blocks long. West 4th, for example, in Vancouver, the core of that commercial activity is only that long. Commercial Drive, I'm sure you can think of many others. That's sort of the walking distance that people like to travel. It's based on human participation in economics. And so the Lower Cove, ironically, is about that long. If you go from the library to the gas station, that's about the distance. In this particular study, we looked at employment, and there were a number of potential places for employment. Artisan Square, obviously, is one of those. The new civic precinct with the community center was a different type of employment that we looked at. The surplus lands around the gas station and heading north, we also saw as mixed-use buildings and potential employment. The Lower Cove, the strip of land, I'm not sure who owns that anymore because I'm not really dialed in on Bowen, but at the time there were considerations of some light industrial in that area near the active gas station, and we considered that a potential mixed-use site as well, with lower income forms of housing over top of that. And then finally, at the foot of Kate's Hill, there's some land which I assume Wolfgang owns, but I can't recall, which is where the buses park. It's a very flat area. That was a potential site for a slightly larger commercial tenant sometime in our magical future, 25 years down the road. There are places like this, small villages in various parts of the Northwest, that tend to attract some of the cooler, younger firms that are doing computer-oriented work, that want to be in a different type of place. So there is potential for some smaller to mid-sized tenants that could be here, but only, I think, if the village was a little bit more vibrant and had more variety and activity to it. But again, we were looking 25 years out. So, in terms of social development, the idea of many housing types, the public space for communal gatherings, those sorts of things needed to be integrated into the plan. And in particular, so the school is up here. This is the upper part of Government Road. This is the proposed development we had for the community center at the time, which is considerably larger, I think, than is being entertained now, including a recreational component, and this was the arts component over here. The yellow was potential expansion space, and we can certainly have a conversation about the community center if we like when I'm done. We did some initial plans for that, which are not in this presentation, but we did do a study of what that facility might look like in the landscape. That's looking down to the Lower Cove there.
Did you consider a municipal hall in the...
We did. That's actually ends up somewhere else in the plan. I'll show you in a moment.
But it was feasible to have it below the community center also, I think.
It is. We did, I think at the time we did three final studies of where the city hall could be, and we concluded in this study that it should be on the old gas station site, linked by a pathway to the community center. That's just looking
Why
at...
did you take a fairly important commercial site and turn it into a public municipal hall?
Well, we envisioned it as actually both. being commercial and a municipal hall. And the reason was that we didn't think that the municipal hall would ever find enough financing on its own, but that if it had a commercial aspect to it, a cafe or something, that would help the income of the development, then perhaps it could make it, essentially. And the other thing, in a lot of the work that we do, we like to mix everything together. Granville Island is a good example of that, where we put things together that people don't usually think should be together, like a cement plant, for instance. But it's employment. It brings people to the site, not just for city business, but because they like to hang out there. This was just looking at mixed-use sites on the island. We also looked at food systems. I'll just quickly go through this. Many of the open space areas we looked at. We also looked at from a point of view of how much sun hits them and were they capable of growing food. And there were a few that we identified. And ideally, we were hoping to create enough of a food environment that our market on the weekend could actually include some significant food on a weekly basis. In terms of public input, I noted that we did have municipal sponsored open houses. This is one of them, excuse me. We also did two of them just on behalf of the consultant team that were private, and they were held in the old gas station, actually. We had a lot of people just casually come by because of that location, which was at the time completely unoccupied. We did a number of presentations which were extremely well attended. Unfortunately, it didn't seem to go anywhere at the time. and I personally walked away from participating in island politics. These are some of the issues that came out of the public consultation. One of them was height. We were proposing some, very few 4-story buildings, but mainly 3-story buildings. Ferry marshalling, the issues, there was, as is typical with the island, there was a split between wanting more ferry traffic and less ferry traffic. The plan we came up with for ferry marshalling was flexible in the end, so it allowed the island to grow or shrink in terms of car activity, which we thought was an important attribute, actually. The expense, we did an extensive study of how things like reducing parking requirements on properties can actually allow properties to develop. In other words, enabling developers to actually develop. Developers aren't evil. Developers actually build our cities. That's the truth. What the cities and municipalities' role is to extract from the developer common things that are good for the community. But the developer builds things, and we need to enable them to do so. Building into the park, or more into the park, less into the park. There's a slide that comes up that shows you that interface with the park and the ferry marshalling. Change in general is always a fearful thing. Some of our designs for the Lower Cove were branded McMain Street and Whistler 2 and things like that. The idea of civic functions on private lands, so the idea of a gas station, for instance, came up at the time. So one of the things, again, just looking at carbon output of the island and that sort of thing, this is basically the way we live on the island. So what I imagined and explained to everybody at the time was, imagine taking all the trees away on the island and looking at where we live. We're one of the most sprawled neighborhoods that I can think of. I mean, we sprawl more than Surrey, for sure. And it's not because anybody here wanted to do that. It's just the way the island developed as a resort and the roads fingered out from the cove and that sort of thing. But when you think about it, it's kind of crazy, right? So what we were thinking of was something that over time, you know, it's not that those houses that are everywhere aren't going to be there. I live in one of them, I'm sure most of us do. But the future development should be concentrated in the cove. And at the time, there was a discussion around there's a fair amount of density on the other side of the island. Perhaps that's a secondary node. Building height. So this is at the bottom is a study by a famous planner called Andres Dewani, who has a transect which basically comes from a rural landscape to an urban landscape and looks at the idea of what the structures and buildings between that need to look like. So we looked at that in a Bowen context, from the Four Corners site being the peak, if you will, of development, where we could allow for 4-story buildings perhaps, and everything cascading away from that down to the rural environment, which seemed to make some sense. And for those that were arguing that we shouldn't have 4-story buildings, I was quick to point out that, you know, Artisan Square has a series of 4-story. These are all Bowen buildings, by the way. The building that Wolfgang did is, you know, 3.5. It's arguably 4 stories, etc. So we have this context already. It's not a foreign thing on the island. And the other important piece of that was that if we were going to enable those types of structures, that we should be stepping them back at the top, so that the scale of the street, which is very important, is always a pedestrian scale. The person doesn't experience those upper floors as they're walking down the streets. And it's also the limit of wood frame construction at the time. That's just an example of a streetscape that does that to some degree. Another one. And some other interesting housing types that we looked at.